In the early 1960s, Thomas Merton realized that Cold War policies were pushing the United States and the Soviet Union into a total nuclear war. The critical need, Merton said, was for humanity's complete change of heart and totally new outlook on the world. Otherwise, a nuclear holocaust would occur. Merton felt a moral and spiritual void at the center of the political system that he called the unspeakable.
When I began to work with that theme, it was with the assassination of President John Kennedy in a previous book, JFK and the Unspeakable. In Gandhi's case, the unspeakable involves dimensions of systemic evil that Merton was talking about, but that in the case of India become unspeakable because Gandhi is assassinated in a way that involves a government whose key figures were very, very closely connected with him. And the government wouldn't have even come into being except for a freedom movement led by Gandhi. So we've got all kinds of unspeakable connections going on here, and that continue to the present day because, again, to use an analogy with President Kennedy, the failure to confront the unspeakable in Gandhi's assassination has resulted in a government being in power at the turn of the century which represented the assassins in terms of the legacy of the assassination. And one could say the same thing is true in the United States in relation to President Kennedy's assassination.
In his raids on the unspeakable, Merton described the unspeakable as the void that contradicts everything that is spoken even before the words are said. The void that gets into the language of public and official declarations at the very moment when they are pronounced and makes them ring dead with the hollowness of the abyss. It is the void out of which Eichmann drew the punctilious exactitude of his obedience. The unspeakable is the void at the core of evil. The unspeakable is the absence of human responsibility and compassion. The unspeakable is the empty denial beneath a complicity in terrifying crimes against the earth and all its creatures.
By looking through Gandhi's eyes, we can see a lot of things going on in JFK's life to take it from that perspective, which is basically what I do in what I plan to say, that we wouldn't normally see. That may be a, a stretch for people. Well, Gandhi and JFK, I mean, these are very different kinds of people. That's true, and that's precisely why it's important to see them together, because we can see all kinds of things, I think, in JFK. If we see it in terms of Gandhi's belief that anybody, including the most powerful person in the history of the world at the time that John Kennedy was president, can turn in the direction of peace. And that's precisely what happened in the case of John Kennedy. That's why he was assassinated.
Gandhi, whose writings on nonviolent Merton was editing in the 60s, would have recognized Kennedy's process at that remarkable moment as the fulfillment of a law of reality. When the means of seeking peace, as I was saying, with a mortal enemy in war becomes trust of that enemy, that's the point when the end is totally transformed.
To pick out one specific point which was critical, I think the Cuban Missile Crisis was the moment, because in the depths of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was losing control of his own government, and we were on the verge of a total nuclear war, and people in the Pentagon, in the CIA, were pushing him very, very hard for an attack on Cuba. And he then sent his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to see Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador in Washington, D.C., and to say that the president needed Khrushchev's help, Chairman Khrushchev's help, and that those missiles had to be pulled out of Cuba immediately, or there was going to be a nuclear war. And Robert Kennedy was very distraught, JFK was very distraught, and that got through. And Khrushchev, when he got the message, he turned to his foreign minister and said, "We have to let Kennedy know that we want to help him." Amazing grace, because at that moment, and as Khrushchev went on the air, on radio and television to say he was going to pull those missiles back, he and John Kennedy became closer to each other than either was to his own military powers. And that, of course, would mean one would be assassinated the next year, and the other, the following year, would be overthrown. And that was tragic, but had they not turned toward each other, you and I wouldn't be talking right now, and this would be a nuclear wasteland, as would be much of the world. If Maryknoll missioners don't emulate Gandhi's message in their work, they're not doing a mission that is out of the gospel. Gandhi said of Jesus, "Living Christ is a living cross. Without it, life is a living death." And Maryknoll missioners, to the extent that they do, as they do, emulate Jesus and his cross and are willing to take on suffering rather than, as the persecutors and oppressors of people are using a sword rather than a cross, or guns really. This is the message of Gandhi. We have to be willing to accept suffering in nonviolent resistance and in creating a new society. That's the message of the gospel, and that's the message of Maryknoll in its embodiment in these various countries where oppression is coming down. And the point isn't to go out and say, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." It's to do Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And that's what Gandhi did.
The discussion was wonderful. He gave a very interesting insight into a number of events.
I'm always searching for the truth anyway, and this is one of the things that really enlightened me to look more for the truth, but I will read the book.
So much food for thought that I'll be speechless for a long time.